The Iran conflict, how one waterway could collapse the global economy. March 1, 2026. Right now, as you watch this video, Iran's Revolutionary Guards are broadcasting a message to every ship near the Strait of Hormuz. No vessel is allowed to pass. Multiple tankers have already made U-turns. Major trading houses have suspended shipments. Insurance costs have tripled overnight. And here's what makes this terrifying. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through this strait every single day. That's 1/5 of the world's entire oil consumption. Gone. In an instant. Around 20 million barrels per day of crude and refined products move through the narrow shipping lane between Iran and Oman, accounting for almost 1/5 of global oil consumption. This isn't a hypothetical anymore. This is happening. Right now. The United States and Israel just launched coordinated strikes across Iran. Iran has retaliated with missile attacks hitting multiple targets including a U.S. air base in Qatar. And now they're threatening to close the world's most critical energy chokepoint. If they succeed, your gas prices don't just go up. They explode. Your cost of living doesn't just increase. It doubles. This is how the global economy collapses. In real time. And most people have no idea it's happening. Let's break down exactly what's at stake. 1. The chokepoint. The Strait of Hormuz. A 33-kilometer wide waterway between Iran and Oman. At its narrowest point, the strait is just 33 kilometers, 21 miles, wide, placing every passing ship within easy reach of Iran's coastline. There are 2 shipping lanes. Each is 2 miles wide. Separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. That's it. And through this tiny passage flows the lifeblood of the global economy. In 2024, oil flow through the strait averaged 20 million barrels per day, or the equivalent of about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. But it's not just oil. Additionally, 22% of global liquefied natural gas trade passes through the strait. Let me put this in perspective. Every single day, $1.2 billion worth of oil passes through this strait. That's based on 2019 prices. At today's prices, much higher. Flows through the Strait of Hormuz in 2024 and the first quarter of 2025 made up more than 1/4 of total global seaborne oil trade and about 1/5 of global oil and petroleum product consumption. And here's the critical detail most people miss. There's no real alternative. Yes, Saudi Arabia has the East-West Pipeline. Saudi Arabia's East-West Pipeline, a 1,200-kilometer infrastructure built to bypass Hormuz, can carry 5 to 7 million barrels per day to the Red Sea. The UAE's Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline adds about 1.5 million barrels per day. Combined, they don't make up half of what normally transits through Hormuz on a given day. So if Iran closes the strait, we lose about 13 to 15 million barrels per day that have no alternative route. That's not a disruption. That's a supply shock unlike anything we've seen since the 1970s oil crisis. 2. What just happened? Let me give you the timeline of the last 72 hours. Because this escalated fast. February 28, 2026. The United States and Israel launch coordinated military strikes across multiple Iranian cities. Global energy markets anticipate extreme volatility and a sharp, war premium, on crude prices following a massive, coordinated military strike launched by the United States and Israel across multiple cities in Iran. These weren't symbolic strikes. They hit Iranian nuclear facilities. Oil infrastructure. Military bases. Iran's response was immediate and severe. Missile attacks targeted Israeli hospitals. U.S. military facilities including Udeid Air Base in Qatar were hit. Multiple sites across the Gulf region under attack. And then came the warning. Iran's Revolutionary Guards warned on Saturday that no vessel would be allowed to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a chokepoint through which nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes. An official from the European Union's naval mission espied said vessels in the region had received VHF transmissions from Iran's Revolutionary Guard stating that no ship is allowed to pass the Strait of Hormuz. The market reaction was instant. Major trading houses are halting shipments through the Strait of Hormuz amid threats from Iranian naval forces to shipping. Lloyd's List Intelligence automatic identification system showed multiple vessels making U-turns in the Middle East Gulf and Gulf of Oman on Saturday. Insurance costs exploded. Before the strikes, ship insurance for the strait increased from 0.125% to between 0.2% and 0.4% of the ship insurance value per transit. For very large oil tankers, this is an increase of $250,000. And here's where we are right now. Some ships are still trying to transit. Others have turned back. Trading houses are suspended. The strait hasn't been officially closed, but it's functionally disrupted. And oil markets? When they reopen, expect chaos. 3. The economic impact. Let's talk about what happens if this disruption continues or worsens. Oxford Economics ran scenario analysis. Here are their findings. In our most adverse scenario, world GDP would be about 0.3% below our current baseline in 2026, reducing GDP growth by 0.1 of a percentage point in 2025 and in 2026. The hit to economic activity would be slightly larger for the US and Eurozone, with GDP growth at 0.4% and 0.5% below our baseline forecasts next year, respectively. But that's the moderate scenario. Let's look at the severe scenario. Goldman Sachs and HSBC have run their own models. HSBC analysts say that crude oil prices could top $80 a barrel if the strait is closed. Goldman Sachs forecasts that it could be $110. But some analysts think even that's conservative. If the Iranian regime feels they face an existential threat, attempts to block the Strait of Hormuz cannot be ruled out. This could present a scenario 3 times the severity of the Arab oil embargo and Iranian revolution in the 1970s, and drive oil prices into the triple digits, while LNG prices retest the record highs of 2022. Let me translate what oil at $100 to $110 means for you personally. Under the severe scenario, the Strait of Hormuz closes, headline and core inflation rise in the months leading up to the closure. This results in a cumulative 1.3 percentage point increase in the annualized headline inflation rate. Gas prices. If oil hits $110, expect to pay $5 to $6 per gallon at minimum. In some regions, $7 to $8. Grocery prices. Everything uses fuel for transportation and production. Expect 15 to 25% increases across the board. Heating and electricity. Up 30 to 50% depending on your region. And this isn't temporary. By June 2026, the cumulative effect on annualized headline inflation falls to 0.8 percentage points. Meaning the impact lasts for months, potentially a year or more. Now let's talk about who gets hit hardest. 4. Regional vulnerabilities. Asia is facing catastrophe. We estimate that 84% of the crude oil and condensate and 83% of the liquefied natural gas that moved through the Strait of Hormuz went to Asian markets in 2024. China, India, Japan, and South Korea were the top destinations for crude oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz to Asia, accounting for a combined 69% of all Hormuz crude oil and condensate flows in 2024. Let's focus on the most vulnerable economies. China. China purchases nearly 90% of Iran's oil exports, totaling about 1.6 million barrels per day. Kpler data show China purchased an average of 1.38 million barrels per day of Iranian oil last year, representing about 13.4% of the 10.27 million barrels per day it imported by sea. If the strait closes, China loses not just Iranian oil but all Gulf oil. That's devastating. India might be even worse. India relies almost entirely on seaborne crude. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are India's biggest oil suppliers. More than 1 million barrels of crude arrive in India daily through Hormuz. India holds 9.5 million barrels of strategic reserves, enough for just over a week of normal consumption. 1 week. That's it. If the strait stays closed for more than a week, India starts facing serious shortages. Japan and South Korea? Similar situation. Heavily dependent on Gulf oil with limited alternatives and small strategic reserves. Europe has slightly more insulation. They've been diversifying since the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Europe has gradually reduced reliance on LNG from the region. But they're still exposed. And any global oil price spike hits them hard. The United States has the most protection. In 2024, the United States imported about 0.5 million barrels per day of crude oil and condensate from Persian Gulf countries through the Strait of Hormuz, accounting for about 7% of total U.S. crude oil and condensate imports and 2% of U.S. petroleum liquids consumption. Plus, the U.S. is the world's largest oil producer. Domestic production can partially offset imports. But don't think Americans are safe. The U.S., as a net energy exporter, may be less affected but still faces inflationary pressures. Oil markets are global. If Asia is paying $110 per barrel, U.S. oil companies will sell at $110 too. Your gas prices still go up. 5. Iran's leverage and limits. So the big question. Will Iran actually close the strait? History says maybe not. The Iranian regime has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz several times in past decades but never actually did so, for a number of reasons. First, Iran depends heavily on the strait for its own energy exports. Second, other countries in the region have officially supported Iran during various crises, and closing the strait could push them into Israel's camp. Third, Iran formally shares control over the strait with Oman. Fourth, closing the strait would antagonize China, Iran's only oil buyer. So Iran has reasons not to close it completely. But they have the capability if they choose. As of 2019, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency estimated that Iran possessed over 5,000 naval mines capable of rapid deployment via high-speed boats. They can mine the strait in hours. They have anti-ship missiles. They have speedboats with torpedoes. And here's the thing. They don't need to physically close it. They just need to make it too dangerous to transit. If Iran were serious about retaliation, it would sink an oil tanker in the Straits of Hormuz. The fact that it isn't doing that means it's bending the knee. But that was said before the latest escalation. Before coordinated U.S.-Israel strikes. Before Iran felt existentially threatened. The calculus may have changed. 6. What happens next? So, where does this go from here? Diplomacy works. Both sides pull back. The ceasefire that briefly existed in June 2025 gets reinstated. Oil flows resume. Prices stabilize. The Iran-Israel ceasefire is having a bearish impact on oil prices when it existed before. This is the best case. Markets are hoping for this. Iran doesn't fully close the strait but harasses shipping. Seizes vessels occasionally. Makes transit dangerous and expensive. Insurance costs stay high. Some ships still transit. But volume drops by 30 to 50%. Oil prices settle in the $90 to $100 range. Inflation stays elevated. Global growth slows but doesn't crash. Iran mines the waterway. Attacks tankers. Makes transit impossible. This is the nightmare. Oil hits $110 to $150. Global recession. Supply chain collapse. Inflation explosion. At this point, it seems we are looking at a full-scale military conflict between the US and Iran, which would be unprecedented and the trajectory impossible to assess. Which scenario are we heading toward? Right now, early March 2026, we're between scenario 1 and 2. Iran has warned ships not to pass. Some ships have turned back. But the strait isn't completely closed. Some traffic continues. If diplomacy wins, we avoid catastrophe. If Iran escalates, we enter unknown territory. 7. What you can do. Okay. So what do you actually do with this information? First, understand this affects everyone. Not just investors. Everyone. Prepare for higher costs. If you can, stock up on essentials now before prices spike further. Non-perishable food. Medications. Fuel if storage is safe. If you invest, consider limited exposure to energy stocks or ETFs. But this is a hedge, not a speculation. Don't bet the farm. If inflation spikes, central banks may raise interest rates. Variable rate debt becomes more expensive. Consider locking in fixed rates where possible. Uncertain times require liquidity. 3 to 6 months of expenses in accessible savings. This situation is fluid. Check reliable sources daily. Energy Information Administration. Financial Times. Reuters. Even in worst-case scenarios, economies eventually stabilize. Panic decisions destroy wealth. Calm strategic thinking preserves it. If markets crash due to oil shock, that creates buying opportunities. Don't try to time the bottom. But be ready to deploy cash when fear is highest. Conclusion. The Strait of Hormuz is the world's most critical energy choke point. 20 million barrels per day pass through it. 27% of the world's crude oil and petroleum products maritime trade. It's 33 kilometers wide. Controlled on one side by Iran. And right now, March 1, 2026, Iran is threatening to close it in response to U.S.-Israel military strikes. Major trading houses have suspended shipments. Multiple tankers have turned back. Insurance costs have spiked 300%. If this escalates, oil could hit $110 to $150 per barrel. Inflation could spike by 1.3 percentage points. Global GDP growth could drop by 0.3 to 0.5%. Asia faces the worst impact. 84% of straight oil goes to Asian markets. China, India, Japan, South Korea are most exposed. But everyone feels the pain. Higher gas prices. Higher food prices. Higher everything prices. The best case. Diplomacy works. The escalation happens. Oil stabilizes. The worst case. Full strait closure. Global recession. Supply chain collapse. Where we actually end up. That's being decided right now. In the next few days. By decisions being made in Tehran, Washington, Tel Aviv. What you can do. Prepare. Don't panic. Stay informed. Think strategically. Because whether you're paying attention or not, the global economy is balancing on the edge of 133-kilometer waterway. And the clock is ticking. If you found this valuable, like and subscribe for more real-time analysis of economic events shaping your financial future. Drop a comment. Are you preparing for potential oil shock? What's your strategy? Stay informed. Stay rational. Stay prepared.